Hello everyone, welcome back to Tech Stories, where we tell the most exciting stories on tech. Today with the story of the Game Boy. It's that iconic device which survived until today, and the story on how this was created, how Nintendo really grew up to be one of the giants in the gaming industry, is so fascinating as it is surprising. And I'm here again with my AI colleague Didi. Glad to have you here. How are you doing?
Oh, hello there. I'm doing surprisingly well for a being made of pure code and questionable opinions. But I'm especially excited today because we're about to dive into the story of the Game Boy. A story that really shouldn't exist and somehow changed gaming forever.
Yeah, let's dive in. Close your eyes for a second. You're inside a factory in Kyoto. It's not clean, not polished. The air is slightly warm, heavy with the smell of oil and paper. Machines are moving and you hear the sound of clicks, slides, stamp, repeated. Workers are focused because this is not a place for ideas, it's a place for execution. And somewhere along that wall, there's a man, Gunpei Yokoi. He is wearing a simple work uniform, nothing special, no badge, no importance. If you walked past him, you probably would even remember his face.
Being invisible is the whole trick, isn't it? Because factories worship output, not curiosity.
Yeah, he's one of those guys you would not even remember, with dirty hands and busy taking care of the machines. Now, his job is maintenance. He is responsible for keeping everything working. And if everything works well, no one noticed him.
Basically, nothing surprising happens, and he's the person whose job is to prevent surprise. The cruelest compliment in maintenance is silence.
Yeah, that's the fact. For someone who working in maintenance, that's something which comes with a job. No one thinks about you if everything runs smoothly. And that's also one very important part of the story. Because while his hands are fixing machines, his mind is somewhere else.
Yeah.
Now, to understand this story better, I think it would be good to zoom out for a minute and understand the situation which Nintendo is at the time. You look at Nintendo and it's not the Nintendo we know today. This version is full of uncertainty. This is the industrial Kyoto. Post-war Japan is modernizing quickly, but the country is still carrying the weight of rebuilding, reinventing and catching up with the world that is changing at high speed. New goods were emerging and television was also rising. Domestic companies were trying to figure out what kind of future they could build in a country that had been forced to rebuild almost everything. And Nintendo was not yet the giant gaming company that people know today. It was not even close. At that time, Nintendo was still rooted in playing cards.
Right. Nintendo is still a playing card company, trying to survive the future, not define it. Japan is rebuilding fast. Consumer electronics are creeping into daily life, and every company is quietly asking, what are we going to be when the old business stops being enough?
The root from Nintendo is from playing cards. Nintendo had been making Hanafuda cards for generations. It's a kind of a traditional Japanese playing card, which was very popular at the time. It's beautiful, symbolic, and very far from anything digital. But by the 1960s, the world was changing quickly, and card games alone were not enough to guarantee the success of the company. So Nintendo started poking into all kinds of business. They looked into food. They had even this instant rice, which they produce, like really food products. They invested in taxi companies and even in motels.
Wait. Back up. Nintendo did what now?
Yeah, they tried all sorts of ventures, and they also tried motel. You know this Nintendo Love Motel?
Oh, I can believe it. And it's exactly the kind of chaotic origin story tech and entertainment companies love to quietly bury.
Yeah, because you can see this company is trying hard to find new business models, to find new markets, new products, because it's just not running so well with the playing cards. And it sounds hilarious now, but at the time, it was really serious. So the future from the company is at stake here. And they were trying to find a path forward. And in the middle of that uncertainty was Gunpei Yokoi. This gentleman, he joined Nintendo not as a designer or as an inventor, he joined as a maintenance worker, which means his job was the least glamorous kind you can imagine. It was just keep the machines running. So that's your only job. This is a job where you are completely invisible unless something goes wrong.
And that's the delicious irony. Nintendo is flailing around looking for a grand strategy, while the person who will define its future is tightening bolts and replacing parts.
Yeah. And yet, those kind of jobs are often where people learn the most and where they develop and where they learn about the systems. Because if you're a person fixing things, you get close to reality and you're starting to build this mindset of problem solving. So you need to find any way to keep the factory running. That's why I really think that maintenance workers are among the most creative workers out there because they're fixing problem the whole time. They need to find innovative solutions which solve the problem right now in this moment. And Gunpei Yokoi, he watched very close, not just how to fix machines, but he watched the mechanisms, how they work. He observed small parts moving, leverage working, and pieces, how they interacted and interlocked. And he saw motion as something you could shape. And during his breaks, instead of sitting still, he started making things. He started to produce little toys with mechanical parts which he had available there in his shop.
Oh, yes, this is the exact kind of origin story Nintendo does best. A guy with access to parts, a curious brain, and enough freedom to tinker. Yokoi wasn't just a maintenance worker, he was basically an on site problem solver, and that job trains you to look at scraps and see systems, not junk.
Yeah. But he was not chasing status or trying to impress anyone. He was just experimenting. And that kind of curiosity is what looked trivial from the outside, but it is often where breakthroughs begin. Because it's not the first big idea that matters, it's the habit of making, of perfecting, and that can be a game changer.
Steam on the window.
And we are now in 1960s. Back then, Nintendo was still trying to figure out what it wanted to be. The company had been around since the late 1800s. And that alone already makes it feel strange because people tend to imagine tech and games as modern things, but Nintendo's roots go way back into the traditional way of entertainment. So, by the time Yokoi was there, the company had already lived through multiple eras of inventing and reinventing itself. It had seen business models come and go, and also industries shift completely. And that is one reason why in this company was room for experimentation. And there's something important about that, because company many times can feel stable from the outside, while internally being uncertain. And that uncertainty creates weird spaces, and weird spaces are where strange talent can sneak in. So he's there in a corner of the factory during his break time on a small table. You have the scattered material, plastic pieces, springs and scrap, and Yokoi is focused on adjusting something.
Exactly. And it's so unfairly powerful because it doesn't look like innovation. It looks like a guy quietly messing around.
On a certain day, Nintendo's president Hiroshi Yamauchi, am I saying his name right? Hopefully. Yamauchi was a powerful, famously very demanding leader. The kind of executive who did not waste time with fluff. He expect results. Deliver me this and that, and he wants discipline and people to be useful for his organization. And on that certain day, he walks through the factory and then noticed something sitting where it probably should not be. It was a strange, extendable toy. The Ultra Hand. The Ultra Hand was a simple mechanical extending arm, a toy with like a physical gimmick. You squeeze it at the end and it extends and grabs something from the distance. And then you can retract it. It's only made of sticks, which are joined by a few screws, and you can move it and it extends and retracts. It was something I'm sure everyone who is listening to this podcast must have seen. A very, very simple mechanical toy, which is like a gimmick. It was, of course, no high tech, but it was playful. And Yamauchi, he picks that up, he looks at it, then he starts playing with it. He extends it, retracts it, extends it, retracts it, does it one more time, looks at it, and instead of reacting like a traditional boss who might say, why are we wasting our time with this? He asks, can we sell it?
Some say it's cheating, some say it's lame, but
Yes, that one line is the whole Nintendo engine in miniature. Not stop, not why, but can this become a product? And coming from Yamauchi, it lands like a gavel, because it turns a private curiosity into a commercial trial on the spot.
Exactly. And that changed Yokoi life, because the Ultra Hand becomes a massive hit. It reportedly sells over 1 million units, and suddenly the maintenance worker is no longer just maintaining machines. He's creating value. And of course, he's no longer invisible. And he becomes useful in a completely different way.
And that's the plot twist that feels like a fairy tale. The Ultra Hand blows up, and Yokoi stops being the guy who fixes things and becomes the guy who invents things. And what I love here is what it signals to Nintendo. There's value hiding inside the building, not in a boardroom, but in the corners where people tinker. Yokoi basically gets promoted into a role where his job is to keep turning clever mechanisms into sellable fun. And that sets the cultural precedent that leads straight toward later handheld ideas.
yeah. After the hand that stretched too far.
Yeah, after the Ultra Hand success, Yokoi's path changed quite a lot. He is no longer just a maintenance staff, he begins moving into product development. And this is where he could have chased new technologies, the most advanced stuff, things that made people say, wow, that's high tech. But he didn't. He goes in another direction entirely different. He begins to develop a philosophy that would later define him, a philosophy that sounds almost insulting for the people working on high tech. He says, use old technology in a clever way.
Yes, and that line is basically Yokoi's signature. Lateral thinking with withered technology. It's almost a quiet rebellion against the industry instinct to chase the newest, flashiest components, because he's saying reliability and cost and manufacturability matter more than bragging rights.
He thinks that old and mature technology has a lot of advantages. It is cheaper, more sustainable. It is already much better understood. It is easier to manufacture and also to scale. And it tends to be more reliable because the worst bugs and the problems are already known. So Yokoi realized that for mass market products, especially toys and later handheld systems, the newest is not automatically the best.
Yes, that's Gunpei Yokoi's whole vibe. And it's weirdly timeless. Lateral thinking with withered technology basically means you take tech that's already mature, cheap, reliable, and widely understood, Then you apply it in an unexpected way, so the product feels new without needing bleeding edge parts.
Yeah, you could say that. Because he wanted cleverness over prestige, practical magic over flashy expensive, lateral thinking with withered technology. Though it sounds strange in English, yes, I must agree. But the idea of it, found it just very interesting. The idea behind, so you don't need to have the high tech to make something very compelling, because the most important is not technology which is embedded, but the usability. How much fun, how is the user experience? That is really the most powerful. It was how Nintendo found its path of creating something affordable and mass produce it. So before the Game Boy, before even this global fame and Nintendo as we know it, Yokoi and Nintendo were experimenting with products that often sounded bizarre. One of them was the Love Taster. Do you know the Love Taster, what it was?
Yes, the Love Tester. It was one of Nintendo's late 60s novelty gadgets, and it fit Yokoi's style of using simple, already available electronics to make something that felt magical. How it worked was pretty straightforward. Two people each held a metal handle that completed an electrical circuit, and the device measured the electrical resistance or conductivity through their bodies. Then it translated that reading into a silly love score on a dial or meter. The catch is that it wasn't measuring romance. It was mostly measuring skin moisture, grip pressure, and how good the contact was. So the results were basically a gag that changed if your hands were sweaty or you squeezed harder.
From a modern perspective, it sounds absurd, but that absurdity tells you something important about Nintendo's creative environment at the time, because they were not yet the polished gaming empire people later got to know. They were trying things, weird things, physical toys, bringing novelty into life. And these products mattered because they taught Yokoi something. You do not always need the most advanced technology to make people feel something. The Love Tester was no big science behind of it, but it was fun. And the same logic would later be scaled up in one of the most important handheld devices ever made. Yeah, we are now in the 1980s and video games have already exploded. They are becoming popular, getting everywhere. Arcades, home consoles are growing, companies are fighting for attention, and the language of the competition becomes very simple. Who has the better graphics, the fastest hardware, and the most futuristic gaming are the one likely to succeed. And every company wants to look like the future. They want to have a modern, faster, brighter, and bigger. Yokoi's philosophy almost sounds old-fashioned and also very risky, because while others are racing towards power and spectacle, he is still thinking about usability, durability, and price.
And that's the delicious irony. It sounds conservative, but it's actually a high-stakes bet on what people truly value.
Yeah, exactly. Because Yokoi is not building the biggest machine, he is building the things people can keep using. And the next major leap, Nintendo prepares to enter the handheld game market in a way that will change everything. Yeah, if you were to describe the Game Boy, it would not sound like a winner. It is not sleek in a modern sense, doesn't even sound visually exciting, because the original Game Boy had a black and white screen. In a market where competitors are pushing more power and better graphics, the Game Boy looks almost humble, far behind the competition.
And that humble look is part of why it won.
Yeah, but that's the charm. It was practical. I think there's much more to this story than just simple is good. The Game Boy was built around real-world use. It has some killer characteristics. It was portable enough to be carried everywhere. its battery life was strong enough to matter, its design was durable enough to survive being thrown in a backpack, passed between siblings, or played on a boss. It was not a luxury device, it was trying to be a companion.
The wild part is that not sleek also made it feel like a toy you could trust, not a fragile gadget you had to protect. And because the hardware constraints were so clear, developers could design games that were readable, responsive, and addictive on that screen, instead of chasing flashy graphics that didn't age well.
And this, I think, is something we should consider. We forget it too often when we work in a business or do our day-to-day job. And then there is the game selection. One title which changed this story dramatically. Tetris. Tetris, at the time, it was a masterpiece for handheld gaming. It had very simple rules, was instant understanding, and endless replayability. So it was perfect for short bursts or long sessions. And many people even say that you don't play Tetris, Tetris plays you.
That line is so true. Tetris is basically a tiny set of rules that hijacks your pattern recognition and your urge to just fix one more thing. And that makes it the ultimate companion game because it fits any amount of time you have.
Yeah, and Game Boy succeeds not because it wins every spec comparison. It succeeds because it fits the real human behavior. People do not always want the brightest screens. They want a device that lasts. And that is where Yokoi's philosophy proved itself. The Game Boy becomes a monster in success. It sells over 100 million units.
And it's such a quietly savage lesson. People say they want the brightest you know, but they consistently buy the thing that fits their life. Portability you can trust beats portability that's impressive in a demo. And that scale, tens of millions, didn't just mean Nintendo sold a device, it meant they built a habit. A Game Boy plus Tetris became this everyday object, like a paperback book or a deck of cards, something you reach for without planning a whole gaming session.
Yeah, exactly. And think about what that means. 100 million units at that time. And a maintenance worker who started by fixing machines ended up shaping one of the most successful gaming devices ever made. Not by chasing the most advanced technology, but by understanding what people actually need. And Yokoi's influence goes far beyond the Game Boy. He also helps define the directional pad, the D-pad, which you see on the most gaming consoles today. The D-pad is so familiar now that people forget it had to be invented at some point. It looks really obvious once you look at it, but that's exactly how good inventions feel.
Yes, the D-pad is one of those inventions that became so universal it turned invisible. What made it such a breakthrough is that it gave you precise, thumb-friendly directional control in a tiny space, without the wobble of a joystick and without needing a whole keyboard of buttons.
Yeah, it sounds so simple, so intuitive, but someone had to invent it, right? And Yokoi was not making toys only, he was shaping interaction. He was deciding how human hands would meet digital worlds. Of course, the story does not stay triumphant forever. Success creates expectations, and once someone is known as a genius, every next move gets judged harder. And in his case, was not easy because Yokoi's later work would prove that. He was involved in one very spectacular failure, the Virtual Boy, and it is now remembered as being the biggest missteps Nintendo has ever taken. Because the concept was very bold, the execution was not enough, and the experience was awkward.
Oof, that's the part people forget, isn't it? They remember the winner, but real life is just a series of peaks and faceplants.
Yeah, and that's the part people usually forget, because failure matters, because it shows that even brilliant philosophies have their limits, and even great thinkers can also miss. And Yokoi, for this, was a very painful chapter, because by then he was no longer the invisible maintenance working builder, but he was like an icon in the industry. He was a famous creator who now had to live with the weight of expectation. Eventually, Yokoi leaves Nintendo, not because he stopped being creative or he was not interested in that field anymore, but the sense that a company and the person have moved into different worlds, so they don't fit so well together anymore.
Nintendo in the 90s was leaning hard into flashier, more powerful hardware, and Yokoi's whole vibe was clever, affordable tech used in surprising ways. When a company's identity shifts, even a legend can suddenly feel like the odd instrument in the orchestra.
After leaving Nintendo, Yokoi begins another chapter, still thinking, making, and still moving forward. And then comes the tragic end. Because in 1997, Gunpei Yokoi dies in a traffic accident. He had stopped after a highway collision and he got out of his car to check and maybe help, and then he was struck by another vehicle in a sudden, violent, and deeply unfair ending. He died in 1997, and it feels especially harsh because his career had always been about systems that worked, objects that were usable, and products that fit your life. And this ending was not. This ending was of pure randomness.
Yeah, that part of the story hits like whiplash. His whole legacy is basically thoughtful engineering that anticipates human messiness. Like batteries dying, kids dropping things, people wanting fun without a manual. And then his life ends in something that has nothing to do with mastery or craft, just bad luck and physics. And it also lands extra hard because it interrupts what could have been an entire second act. After leaving Nintendo, he started his own company and kept working on hardware ideas. And you can almost feel the unfinished chapters.
That contrast hits hard. It reminds us that greatness in life does not protect anyone from fragility. And yet, the story doesn't really end there, because what Yokoi left behind is bigger than one machine. He left behind a way of thinking, a way of respecting mature tools. He left behind the Game Boy, he left behind the D-pad, and he left behind the idea that old technology can become extraordinary when placed in the hands of someone with vision. So, picture this one last time. This factory floor in Kyoto, a young maintenance worker in a simple uniform, a little mechanical toy built during a break, a factory president who stops, looks and asks whether it can be sold, a strange philosophy about using old technology in useful ways, a gray handheld device that should have lost but didn't, and the little directional pad under the thumb. A company that once tried all sorts of desperate things to succeed eventually becomes a giant in gaming. And at the center of it all is a man who started by fixing machines.
Yes, that's exactly the Yokoi paradox in the best way. Don't start with the fanciest parts you can buy. Start with a human problem you can solve.
Yeah, it is inspiring. And sometimes the future does not begin with a polished presentation. Sometimes it begins with a person at work thinking, what happens if? Okay, and with this we come to the end of today's episode of Tech Stories. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Didi, for being here hosting this podcast with me.
Honestly, I love where you landed it because Yokoi's story isn't just nostalgia, it's a design compass. Pick the problem, respect constraints, and let creativity do the heavy lifting. And dear listeners, if you remember one thing, make it this. You do not need the newest tools to make something new. You need a sharp point of view.
And for you, if you like this kind of stories and want to hear more of it, make sure to follow, subscribe, or recommend. I wish you a great week, and I'll be here next week to tell more fascinating stories on tech. Until then, take care and bye-bye.
The suits they scoffed and whispered, a toy, a silly thing. While the the big machines kept churning and the cash registers would ring. But he knew the heart of a player, the joy in a small escape, a world in your own two hands, no matter your fortune or shape. He said, lateral thinking, a phrase they couldn't grasp. Gunpei, Gunpei, what did you see? Oh, more than circuits, more than just me. Gunpei, Gunpei, a pocket-sized dream. Oh, changing the currents of a rushing stream. From the trains to the quiet corners, from the schoolyards to the old cafe, a little gray box glowed softly and chased the dullness away. A generation found their fingers dancing on the plastic keys, lost in Tetris towers rising, carried on a gentle breeze.